Thank you. I want to thank the organizers of SSC. It's certainly a privilege to be here. I wanted to say one thing about myself, kind of to tease you. I'm a practicing physicist. I call myself a noeticist after what Plato taught a couple thousand years ago. He said no matter how brilliant you were or how vast your storehouse of knowledge, noetic insight was beyond that, or your base, it came from the cosmos. So as a noeticist, I've tried to use some of that. And some of this is in my book coming out in July. I have the first model of interactionism in existence, and it solves some of the problems. Chalmers said the problem of consciousness is tantamount to the problem of qualia. I have the first physical model of qualia in history, and the model should give the handles to lead into actually, in physical terms, breaking down the first-person, third-person barrier. Besides being a physicist, I'm a high priest in the Mormon Church, and it appears to be a Mormon doctrine that before our civilization develops warp drive travel, their millennium will start and they'll be taken off planet. So there's only one that'll hint on that. It says only angels who are of the earth serve the earth. And so kind of our Edgar Mitchell or something that I thought I would just tease you with that, as I hope I have also the handles that Eric was talking about that will lead to the breakthrough physics. Eric talked about some of these things, the huge sun-sized energy sources and that are required. It is my opinion that the current physics, four-dimensional physics, which governs the Big Bang, quantum theory, gravitational theory, all of these are insufficient to solve the problem of warp drive. So all of these things need to be extended in order to do this. And I hope I'm going to be able to make some of that clear to you. Any one of these things could be a topic of a talk. These anomalous gravitational effects that are in the Pioneer effect or something like that, it looks like there's a duality to gravity. And we need to complete gravity. I don't believe there's a quantum gravity per se. That's not the regime of integration. Newton claimed that the effects of gravity were instantaneous. Einstein said that's not possible because of the special relativity. But we know from the EPR experiment that there is an instantaneous connection. And there's no way of getting around that. And it doesn't seem to be discussed in the people who are working on quantum gravity, but it's that other part of gravity that is going to be important, I think, to warp drive, to use to complete a dual form of gravity. Hal Puthoff's work on the polarized vacuum, that's heavily, I rely on that heavily in my model, but again, I think Hal pretty much uses a four-dimensional model. Using a string theoretic, they settled down to 11 dimensions now. I use a 12-dimensional model because there's an additional anthropic action principle. I assume that the Hubble sphere is a form of complex self-organized system in a multiverse with a potential for an infinite number of nested Hubble spheres, each with their own fine-tuned laws of physics. So I'm looking for the model I want to present it is we still use the Alcubierre warp drive metric, but it's more for orientation. We don't need huge mass because of a utility of mini-wormholes. We cover the warp bubble with wormholes, with the mini-wormholes, and there's a way of creating that kind of a dome. A simple metaphor which isn't quite on target is, remember from your junior high school physics demonstration where there was a table with hundreds of holes and air was forced through it and the puck became frictionless. So in this new 12-dimensional, I call it the Holographic Anthropic Multiverse, which is a 12-dimensional form, we use a full-blown Heisenberg Potentia model where the background is, there's been some controversy in physics about that, whether before you take a measurement, does anything exist? We're claiming that, let me sidestep for a moment here, traditionally it's been said that the extra dimensions are microscopic at the Planck scale curled up beneath us. There's a little bit of talk about large-scale extra dimensions, which I use, so instead we're in a virtual reality. Our four-dimensional is the same as if you put on virtual reality glasses. We're a four-dimensional subspace of a much broader, much higher dimensional space. And so what this allows, which I'll show you, is a figure ground effect. So you use something like a top-Mach spherical reactor to just generate sufficient energy to curve the space, and then to remove the spaceship from the background, and then drop it back in. And is in the let's say a Necker cube. When you look at the Necker cube, you see the vertices switch. So we want to apply that to this new regime, a topological switching, and the warp factor would be kind of the switching length between the switches. Whether it's a whole new, where does a new kind of Dirac vacuum breakdown and a unique string vacuum enter into play, I'm not sure where to draw the line, but anyway, I use them somewhat synonymously. Bohm and de Broglie got stuck. You couldn't complete quantum theory in 4 dimensions. In 12 dimensions, it's turned out to be quite easy to complete quantum theory. The way we've known historically that when the correct theory comes along, it has certain properties. It is elegant, logical, internally consistent, and has broad explanatory power. I'm leaving the conference a little bit early because there's a British hedge fund that's promised me 10 million British pounds to build a quantum computer built on this model, and there's another Hungarian group offering 7 million euros, so I don't know if they'll come up with it, but we'll get into that in a little minute. In a minute, this is a very important part of it. I touched a little bit on what has to be done to complete geometric dynamics. This is essentially based on a new set of noetic, I call it the noetic transformations after the anthropic multiverse, which my new model of cosmology is. I spent about 15 years developing that. The Galilean transform, the Lorentz-Poincairé transformations, they're for a particle pretty much traveling along the x direction. And people, one of my co-authors, Elizabeth Rauscher, in her research, and I've expanded on that, and the fellow from helped put us is got the other. He's done work on superluminal Lorentz boost also. But in the new transform, you boost one in Elizabeth's work. I'm not sure it's so much in. Gosh, why am I drawing a blank on it? Really apologize. When you do a superluminal Lorentz transform, you boost a spatial dimension to a temporal dimension. Well, I do an additional boost. Let me back up again. Kramer took the Wheeler-Feynman model and made his transactional model of quantum theory. I extended that also to cosmology. So cosmology itself, we have in a sense, the present is still a standing wave of the future past, but you have in a sense 3 Minkowski packages which create the standing wave of the present. There's a complex space for the future and a complex, so that's how you create this subspace. Because if we're to be a virtual subspace of this higher dimensional subspace, you have to have a way of taking the part and putting it back together again, kind of a la Dirac's annihilation and creation metaphors. So in the new set of transformations, you don't just boost along the x dimension, you have to boost along all 3, x, y, z simultaneously. This is, and you do it twice. You do it. There's going to be more of this cosmology. Let me leave that there for a minute till we get into the new cosmology. It's the there's so many new things. It's a leap. It's a bigger leap than the usual leap because there's so many, you know, in string theory, the Calabi-Yau, what? I can have only 5 minutes left. I just started.
5 minutes left out of 15 for your talk, and then 5 minutes for questions.
No, I have 40 minutes.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Okay. Oh, it's nice to be here. I wanted an excuse like this. All right, I'm going to take this pause to tell the joke I forgot about. A friend of mine used to go to Russia in the 70s, nuclear physics conferences, and you know, the grand Russian hotels with marble staircases, brass banisters, and the huge tapestries. But other amenities were missing. One time he had to do a dump, and so he said to his Russian colleagues, you know, there's no toilet paper in there. So his Russian colleague pulled out a corded manuscript. So there's 2 conclusions to this. One is, be careful when you give your manuscript to your Russian colleague. You're not sure what he's going to do with this. And the second one is, I hope my talk today will be better than toilet paper. So. And, you know, all right. So cosmology is like the domino. All of these things pretty much rely on a new understanding of cosmology. They're all related. Our understanding of quantum theory, gravitation, special relativity, the Dirac equation are all based on understanding cosmology. Here's my other book from last year. This is really a treatise, the best treatise I have to date on this new cosmology. It has the design for quantum computing, and the thing that allowed me to come here today, this is my first foray into FTL warp drive, is there's one of the chapters where I tell how to build a defense shield that will withstand nuclear ordnance. And that's because of so it's those same principles that I'm applying here for the warp drive of today. But all of this is really, it's a new higher dimensional understanding of the Dirac vacuum. And again, so this model is empirically testable, and part of building the quantum computer will empirically test that. There's another way. Stanley Prusner, for example, he's stuck on what makes the prion going to go its conformational change. I'm going to try to get him, that's an easier experiment. It's the same principle as the quantum computer because it's more macroscopic. You can put the prion molecules inside and use the space-time system of lasers and things. We'll talk about that in a minute. But this book has much more of it than I can give here, and I have another agenda. I want to build a new class of medical devices. So in the preface, I said this book is a Nobel Prize giveaway. There's at least probably 12 Nobel Prizes that I've put a handle in here that people could, you know, if I was a better physicist, I already written the definitive paper on how to violate the quantum uncertainty principle, which is one of the chapters. I call it probability 1. And in the early days, you applied a continuous Z field to the Stern-Gerlach devices, and you got space quantization. For 100 years, by definition, that has led to the uncertainty principle, which is supposed to be not able to be violated. Well, the first simple answer is do something else. So what is that something else? So we know from Einstein that the space-time vacuum is an energy-dependent space-time metric. In Hubble discovered redshift, not expansion of the universe. So one of the best evidences for the Dirac vacuum is the Casimir effect, and there's others. So if you have a Dirac polarized vacuum, you have photon has some mass. And this is part of a new transformation which allows the vacuum to be manipulated to build a warp drive or do some of these other things. So simply, you, oh, here we go. I decided to call my model the holographic wormhole drive. That for all practical purposes does not require hardly any negative energy because the infinite energy is built into the vacuum. In the same way that you violate the uncertainty principle, if in this new cosmology, instead of the quantum particle in the box, three-dimensional box, we have, if it's conformally scale invariant through the 12 dimensions, what's going on, the particle I'm going to have to do some more of the cosmology to make this more understandable. The 12th dimension is, it takes a minimum of 12 dimensions to be causally free of the three-dimensional particle in the box. That's like the mirror image of the mirror image. So you can read, you have the ability then to read out the quantum state in a higher dimensional resonance mode. And this is one of the last remaining problems in quantum computing. Moore's law, never wrong, suggests that we'll have a quantum computer by about 2012. If I get that money, that may be the case, but it's a phase change. Snell's law, put a stick in water, it bends a little bit. So I don't know how many degrees that is, so I'm predicting between 2012 and 2015. I have high confidence that that's possible because of the, in a sense, simplicity. I'm sure there's some curves of this model. So all right, let me go back. Let's wait, see if it's also written out. Okay, we'll come back to it in a minute. One of the current drives thinking is the large wormhole. People say, well, that's somewhat impractical as you need such a large mass. Alcubierre's warp drive metric is a beautiful solution to Einstein's equations. Space stretches in a wave head of the ship and contracts behind, and then, as you all know by now, inhabitants of the warp bubble travel along a free fall geodesic, not moving locally at FTL velocities. I just like, this is another redundant, but it's just a pretty picture from Anderson Industries, their model of the warp drive. Same thing, the negative energy requirements are supposed to be infinite, and to do warp factors is the same thing. But with a new space-time transform that allows one to, so it's the array of mini-wormholes that through the new model of this hierarchy that you're able to cover the warp bubble with. And that again is like that high school experiment where the air coming out of the holes makes it frictionless. So it's a holographic figure ground effect. If the actual universe, and this is one of my major postulates, time will tell if it's a good one, is a holographic background. We know that our reality comes out of that infinite potentia, and with the new gravity that has instantaneous connection, you lift that warp bubble out of the background, and when you drop it back in, it goes. Then that's how it advances along the space. So it's just a simply in that sense a way of manipulating the topology, the higher dimensional topology of space-time. The holographic principle first proposed by 't Hooft. I use a very maverick extension of the holographic principle. They wanted it to be a two-dimensional information surface on black hole horizons. But I use it more as the universe is a hyper-hologram. We live in a hyper-hologram that's at least 12 dimensions. Maybe when you have the infinite number of nested spheres for just our Hubble sphere in its cast, in its embedding, maybe to access the rest of them, you maybe need twice that 24 dimensions, but that's also for later. So in the infinite, just have a couple of cute images of how our reality can emerge from this infinite potentia. This also applies to consciousness. So this also digressing for a moment, this same model, once you get this understanding of the vacuum and get all of these things, in history has shown that those elegant theories that we've had in the past, that the correct one has vast explanatory power. So this model is able to explain a lot of things. So the new transform will also break down the first-person, third-person barrier. I'm having still one final piece of trouble with that because I don't know in the infinite potentia where is a person so I can send the signal. I need one further understanding of the space-time, to be able to down convert. But the rest of it is fairly simple mathematics extending the Lorentz-Poincairé just to use a triple boost and complex space and boosting from space to time to energy. So my radical extension, Hubble hyperhologram, duality, reality itself, the thing that has not been thought of before, we consider only the microscopic, we want to collapse the wave function, that it's happening as something microscopic, but I tell you in this model that reality itself is the first stage of collapse. So we have this, that might be, so we have the Planck constant at the bottom and the cosmological constant at the top. So this wave structure of our reality is embedded in that. This is just this is the key to a very low energy warp factor. Is just this. You're going to switch in this figure ground effect by extending. Oops. By extending the number of topological switching distances that you want to use with a little more power, so that you increase the warp factor. The whole thing about going faster than the speed of light in this model is a bit of a misnomer, although it still applies because, I don't know what it would take to be able to, this model, as you can see, it would predict we should be able to have instantaneous travel if we knew how to, once we, maybe the fourth generation or later on. It's based on a new cosmological, you've heard of, I think it was Kepler who first talked about close packed spheres. So there's a least cosmological unit, which is a form of close packed cosmological sphere. Here's where we get into some of why this new cosmology is going to take a little bit of study, because, well, it's a continuous state cosmology, so in a sense we're already in free fall, and that would take some. One of the main chapters in that book talk about this, where first of all, the Holographic Anthropic Multiverse is an advanced form of Einstein's static universe, but it's just these. So from there's a Calabi-Yau mirror symmetries, Kähler manifolds. There's an infinite number of possibilities for them. So it's easy to stick with them. So Kramer's model, which I extended to cosmology, you would then talk about the string theoretic vacuum, and so you would have a mirror symmetry or duality between the Calabi-Yau manifolds, where one would then be the future and the past, and we'll get up to that again in a minute. So string theorists have been looking for a unique compactification. Some look for a 4-dimensional compactification, another 9, 6, 8. That's a mistake. In the continuous state one, all the compactifications, it's a continuous state through all of them. And they go from odd to even dimensions from branes down to the string to a 0 point. And it's like a Riemann sphere that flips from 0 to infinity, and it's called a Witten vertex. So you get a continuous dimensional reduction, spin exchange, compactification, dimensional reduction, which is this part of, so this is this whole geometric topological background that allows the holographic multiverse to have these properties of an infinite potentia, and for us to be able to use it to do the warp drive as just a simple topological switching. I say simple as kind of a joke, but in a sense it's simpler than the other ways, and use less energy, because you can program the vacuum to in the new transform, because you get what are not the tachyon things, but through constructive. You throw a stone in water, you get ripples. You throw the second one, you get areas of constructive interference and destructive interference. So it's that kind of a metaphor. You're going to be able to coherently control, instead of space-time left alone coming back to its standing wave of the future past in its place where it would be if left alone. When you program it and mess with it, And it's just going to fall back into a down the line place towards your Alpha Centauri or wherever you're trying to go. Just a little metaphor for the continuous state. And again, the present is a standing wave of the future past. If those of you who don't know anything about Kramer, it's a beautiful thing to read anyway. It's just so wonderful. An author wave is sent back and sent out, and you get a return wave which ends in a confirmation wave which ends in a transaction, which is like a standing wave. And part of the thing that supports my conformal scale invariance is that Kramer says all the off-diagonal elements are physically real. So that it all ties in. There's just a whole lot of little pieces that give credibility to this model. Here's a metaphor for the dimensional reduction, only up to 4 dimensions, but it has to go through 12 dimensions. So you'd have, in a sense, a regular Minkowski space with a past one and a future one that allow it to do its standing wave properties. Currently, for most physicists and cosmologists, the universe ends at Planck. It's a rigid, impenetrable barrier. We used to live in a Newtonian universe. Now most physicists say we live in a quantum universe. So I suppose by that, when they discover the unified field, we'll live in some kind of a unified universe. But in this continuous state model, that's not it either. We live in a continuous transform from classical to quantum to unitary. And it's the unified field that runs this whole big structure. So here's my metaphor for the least cosmological unit. One unit like this couldn't exist separated. It would be like a quark. Instead of the rigid barrier, this is the Witten vertex, which is like an icing model. It would flips. When it gets down to 0, it flips back again from 0 to infinity. So that's why you have the continuous state and conservation of energy. And it also has, in physics, they look for, well, is it a wave or is it a particle? And some is a few, so it's a wavicle, but the real thing is it is the properties, whatever it is, it has both properties simultaneously. And this, in a sense, has some of that. Here's kind of the field, and here's kind of the particle, the barrier. So, and it's this. If you can imagine standing in the center of the room with the 4 walls, but in each corner there are some large mirrors. So you could look into infinity in those corner mirrors, and you would see yourself in the back. And part of the Calabi-Yau mirror symmetry, I didn't notice this until recently, but in the first one you see your face, but in the next one you see the back of your head. So there's an odd even symmetry to that, but it's that. So now here's one of the more major points. To violate the quantum uncertainty or to run this vacuum, you use a system of resonances where you, so as the spatial dimension or the particular part of it, but if you look straight into the mirror, you're blocked. You can't, that's kind of a sense synonymous with the quantum uncertainty principle. You can't see the rest of it. You can't access anything you do to that image, it's blocked. But because of this continuous state metaphor, where the image, it's like a movie theater metaphor. You're sitting up by the projector, you have the discrete frames of film, but up on the screen is the continuous model of reality. And that's one part of it. And then so as the thing cycles, there's these gaps. And instead of using the continuous field that we quantize space with, we use what's an incursive resonant oscillator so that your time segment is shortened. So you have a gap in between the creation of the space-time present, so you can shoot your laser up through those gaps, through this hierarchy, and use that to manipulate the topological structure. It's very amenable to this, called programming the vacuum. So to run the spaceship, you would have you know, like when we're using radio, the two signals embedded in each other, modulation, one part of the signal would create the, by the constructor, is a coherence length. So you would set it to the coherence length to the dome size that you wanted. Another parts as those least units, which would create, allow one factor of them to create the little wormholes that cover the dome, and then another one to bend the Alcubierre metric, and another one to do the topological switching. So it would be a complex resonant hierarchy to run this drive, but that can all be worked out. Again, just a metaphor for our reality coming out of the holographic. Not long ago, 30 years ago, this is how they looked at those extra dimensions as curled up little spheres. And now they've turned into these Calabi-Yau manifolds, at least 6-dimensional more. So you have the other thing that aids in this. De Broglie-Bohm talked about a pilot wave of the quantum potential. So the first step up, you have a super quantum potential. But then when you get up to the unified field, that governs it. It's also a governing factor. So the top 3 dimensions are probably just the controlling field that keeps this all symmetric as it. But the key point that I want to make is what is these lower R reality, the space, time, and energy, as they are built. So one more thing, if this helps. In Copenhagen, matter was created at the Big Bang, protons. But in de Broglie-Bohm matter waves and Dirac, a proton is created, annihilated, and created. So we have this wave structure of matter and of reality. It's hard to grasp at first, if this is the first time you hear that our reality could be so virtual. But again, the whole list of things that I've been able to solve with using this model seems to indicate that it could be true. And if once I can do the experiment that start to prove this, that will be a good indicator. Again, just other modes of the space-time metric to show how these are from the main string theory book by Green. And I think one's from the Encyclopedia of Physics that show how these topological things from a vacuum structure. So as I tried to mention, there's a leapfrogging of field and point. It's not, we don't go all the way down to Planck because in this model, because the Ising-Witten flip happens before that, where it goes back. So there's no, so you get a whole new idea of what discreteness means. This is again another metaphor for, if this is the Euclidean present, you have a complex space for the past and a complex space for the future that advanced retarded that make the thing all run. This is part of just a metaphor for the hierarchy to set up the laser resonances. Along these lines, this would just be one, say our Minkowski one, but you would actually have with the future past, you'd actually have 2 of them. As I mentioned, space to time to energy is part of this new noetic transformation. And I mentioned also goes from classical to quantum to unitary. These are very important key elements to have as part of the way this cosmology operates in its continuous state modes. And I was able to derive a very simple equation in its unexpanded form. I derived this out of string theorists say there's 10 to the 1,000 or 10 to the googolplex possibilities for a string vacuum. This was one of the other things that fell out of this model, one unique string vacuum. This is a very simple equation, energy over rotational radius, that allows one to program it. This is again just the unexpanded form of the equation, and it affects the topology. You can see, so the energy is going to switch to the radius because it's not, in the wave particle part, it's not a real barrier, but it's a, like when we send signal, radio signals to the rarefied, just having the molecules be there, it's enough to make a barrier to some television radio signal, so that it's a domain wall. And here's the part about the 12 dimensions arising. This is the singular point from the 12 dimensions. This is kind of out of string theory. Oh, what I forgot is that field equation that I developed takes the same form as this equation for string tension, which was one of the things that made it become promising. So we have the large-scale string tension with the cosmological constant, and then the small one for the Planck-sized diameter. This is just how the dimensions continuously compact. Another metaphor, they go out, with the Calabi-Yau mirror symmetry, they go back and forth. I know I'm not making this very clear, but it's this structure that allows one to program space-time through these resonance modes, because it becomes just a simple timing when it's at the particulate or the barrier part. That's either your signal can bounce off it or it does one thing, but then when the hole is open through the field part, that's when you can go up to the next level in the resonance hierarchy. This is just to show where this is a standard picture of the present status of string theory. They had the 5 theories or 6 theories, and they now call it M theory, and it's cast in 11 dimensions. I finish it off with 12 dimensions because there's this anthropic principle which drives it as a complex system only for the Hubble part of it. In this model, if you went out to a Hubble radius, you'd be able to see another Hubble radius. Let's see if there's anything else that again, so this infinite potential, the background, it has all of the geometry of all particles. It's going to be able to all fall out of it. So it's this is an early equation on how to describe my holographic anthropic model, a unique vacuum. Some other, I guess, another metaphor for an image of the Noetic field equation and how it's able to manipulate the topology as it's undergoing all those processes. And this is one of the key elements to break through space quantization and violate the quantum uncertainty principle. Use an incursive oscillator. So when you're doing your boosts and you don't allow the space quantization to be the rigid barrier, with the incursive oscillator you can adjust delta t to have different size hole for your resonance. This is another model there. Another model of reality, how it all relates to consciousness. They all become the same thing. The awareness, or just another model of the standing wave future past. Here this one is a little bit good for covering it with wormholes. This is, again, how you would ramp up the resonance hierarchy. What it's interesting to do is you have a principle of physics that's used for something else, and it applies to this. This is a metaphor as far as I've gotten on the new transform, where you start out in regular Euclidean space. Part of this maybe is reversed, and then it's a mirror symmetry of the two double boosts, triple boosts. So you're going to this same Noetic transform, which will allow you to run the warp drive, is the same one that will allow us to develop ESP machines, because it will once we figure out how to say where the person is, we'll be able to send the signal. One more quick thing. It's this space-time exaplex that allows the programming, and this is also in the book, and I guess this is part of the metaphor for the programming the hierarchy. You start with the classical oscillators, and you go down to incursive oscillator, which allows you to, and then, you know, it will rely on a spheroidal, the regular tokamak reactor won't do it, but just a fairly low amount of resources tokamak reactor program with all of these, this huge array of things I tried to explain very briefly will allow for the drive to operate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard. We have time for 2 brief questions.
I wonder if you could explain a little bit more on one of the early introductory points. You mentioned this new noetic transform that involves boosting along all 3 axes, but as a physicist, frankly, I don't understand what it means to boost along multiple axes simultaneously. Any combination of vectors is simply another vector that has a particular direction. The x, y, and z axes are just mathematical constructs with no physical meaning.
Yeah, it would take me a bit to do it more rigorously like you wanted me to, but the only way that it works is because you're using a 12-dimensional space-time and you're coupling into these processes that are going on. But one of the key points to be aware of is that is already all going on as we're embedded in and made out of these materials for the observer. So you have to uncouple. If you uncouple that for part of our life, you know, I postulated along the Tower of Life principle that transform is already in the continuous state process. That transform is already operating in the background all by itself. So in a sense, all we have to, when you meditate, you get a revelation from God or a clairvoyant experience, you've somehow uncoupled, centered yourself, and gone up to that domain that it already occurs. So in order now to try to describe it, it's in doing it within all of the dimensions have to be used. So it's a stationary, instead of like you're having a particle along the x-axis, it's more of a stationary boost where you just couple and uncouple to boost into a regime that's already there, and want to carry the coupling point of your awareness or of these other elements into a regime that's already there. You know, Einstein said if you could saddle a photon, you could circumnavigate the universe without the passage of time. That regime is already there, so I'm working on this transform to describe that. I don't know if that's a help, but I think for the purpose of this symposium, that's probably all I can say about it.
Okay, thank you again, Richard.
Okay.